From July to November of 1917, Australian soldiers fought alongside their British, French, and Dominion allies in an ambitious strategy to drive the German army from Belgium. But what began as a determined campaign to break through the German line, advance eastwards, and launch amphibious attacks against U-boat bases on Belgium's North Sea coast narrowed to a fight for a small village atop the farthest ridge of the Ypres salient. Many of the battles that led to the Allies securing the village of Passchendaele were fought in the most difficult conditions experienced by soldiers on the Western Front. Amid this wrecked landscape, nearly 500,000 men became casualties in 14 weeks of fighting. The all-volunteer Australian Imperial Force faced no sterner test during the Great War than the battles of Third Ypres. Today, the magnitude of their ordeal and the extent of their sacrifice in one of the war's defining campaigns remains difficult to imagine. In this portrayal of the battles, explore in detail how events unfolded, from opening attacks through to the fighting in the muddy quagmire before Passchendaele. The ambitious British offensive to drive Germany out of Belgium began under the command of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig. Involving soldiers of the British, Dominion, and French armies, it continued until the 10th of November before making way for the Battle of Cambrai and the pause in major fighting brought about by the harshest of the winter months. To recall Third Ypres a century later is to look upon a series of battles that expose the most gruesome conditions of the Great War. A combination of brutal attrition with newly evolved artillery tactics. A shockingly bleak environment of pummeled, waterlogged battlefields, where mud claimed men and horses in their thousands, and clouds of poisonous gas drifted silently across the desolation, whilst all the while the greatest amount of artillery fired anywhere in the war fell on the morass of puddled craters, splintered tree stumps, ruined farmhouses, and menacing pillboxes. The British Prime Minister at the time, David Lloyd George, confided in the editor of a British newspaper weeks after the conclusion of Third Ypres. If people really knew, the war would be stopped tomorrow. But of course they don't, and they can't know. The correspondents don't write, and the censorship won't pass the truth. The thing is horrible and beyond human nature to bear, and I feel I can't go on with this bloody business. The series of battles that made up Third Ypres have become more popularly known as the Battle of Passchendaele. The village of Passchendaele rests atop the last ridge of the Ypres salient, 11 kilometers east of Ypres itself, and 8 kilometers from a railway junction at Roulers, vital to the supply system of the German Fourth Army. In the broader ambitions of Haig's initial strategy, Passchendaele would have been a jumping-off point for the Allied forces in their push further into Belgium, rather than marking the end of the offensive. But this retitling of Third Ypres to Passchendaele masks the extent of Haig's original strategy, which included not only driving the German army from Belgium, but in the process destroying the German U-boat bases at Ostend and Zeebrugge. This grand scheme reflected an awareness of the magnitude of world events that were in play by the middle of 1917. Against this backdrop of worsening fortune for the Allies, Britain assumed the main burden for launching the next offensive. Senior political and military figures put forward arguments for and against Haig's strategy, but he prevailed, and planning went ahead for the July offensive to be launched outside of Ypres. By 1917, more than 500 years old, and no stranger to occupation and siege, the city of Ypres lay in ruins, veiled in smoke and dust. Where once Ypres had rivaled Paris as a flourishing city of textiles, it was now the foremost jumping-off point before the front lines of battle in the British sector and the most heavily bombarded target on the Western Front. Ypres, as the British soldiers delighted in mispronouncing its name, was also the last Belgian city before the coast, a devastated but vital symbol of why Britain had entered the Great War, to liberate Belgium from the German army. Through these ruins passed countless convoys of materiel and processions of soldiers on their way to the front lines of the war in the Ypres salient. Passing the shattered cloth hall onto what had been the prosperous city's market, the Grand Place, they snaked on between the stone lions of the Menin Gate, down the Menin Road, into the desolation of the Flanders fields and the battles of Third Ypres. Beneath the fractured and ruined streets and dug into the city's ramparts existed stockpiles of munition, aid stations, billets and garrisons, well sheltered from the constant German bombardment. Soldiers who paused here on their journeys found solace in the gallows humor of the trench newspaper, the Ypres Times. One poem perfectly expressed the ironic tone the paper struck, which the soldiers found so endearing. Titled, "With the Usual Apologies," the poem read, "If you can crawl through wire and crump holes, reeking with feet of liquid mud, and keep your head turned always to the place you are seeking, through dread of crying, you will laugh instead. If you can fight a weak in hell's own image, and at the end just throw you down and grin, you'll be a soldier one day then, my son." By the second half of 1917, the fields and woodlands of Belgium had steadily transformed under incessant artillery fire into a mire of churned earth, debris, and splintered, broken trees. Heavy rain fell across the Ypres salient, transforming the already destroyed landscape into a sea of mud, upon which soldiers of the Allied armies struggled against their German counterparts. Leaving the solid surfaces of roadways, soldiers would wend their way forward along tracks made from duckboards, careful not to slip off into the quagmire on either side. In single file, they slowly trekked towards the starting lines of battles, steady targets for snipers, machine guns, mortars, and artillery. Understandably, soldiers were constantly unnerved by what they saw around them, making feelings of loneliness and despair difficult to counter. Blended into the roiled landscape, the violence of war was regularly found in the dark, still form on the wayside. Thousands of soldiers and horses were lost to the deep, sucking mud and remain buried there to this day. Ahead of the battles themselves, teams of engineers were tasked with creating paths to the front and regularly needed to find clever ways to ensure these survived in the muddy, waterlogged expanses of land. But as the weather worsened and the Allied advance closed on Passchendaele, the quagmire became overwhelming. Within this morass, stretcher bearers demonstrated a quite different type of courage to the infantrymen they aided. Their slow and repeated forays into no man's land and back down the line to relay points and aid stations was extremely strenuous work. They had to resist instinctive responses of fight or flight, instead conditioning themselves to the perils of slow, methodical endurance. As they struggled back with the wounded, and in the process were themselves killed, their plight reflected a different view to that of the generals, who described the great successes of battles. in mud on the battlefield of the Ypres salient. This newly deployed British tank, a Mail Mark IV, lies abandoned amid the waterlogged shell holes. The unditching beam, made from wood reinforced with sheet metal, is still stored across the top. If the tank became stuck, the beam could be attached to the tracks by the crew, often under enemy fire, and then dragged beneath the vehicle to provide grip. The Mark IV was a British design, introduced in mid-1917. A total of 1,220 were built, making it the most produced British tank during the war. It was first deployed at the Battle of Messines Ridge, just weeks prior to the commencement of Third Ypres. Although several tanks are considered to have made important contributions to the outcome at Messines. At the Battle of Passchendaele, they literally sank into the waterlogged, muddy ground, becoming easy targets for enemy artillery. Rainfall in the Ypres salient, particularly during August and October of 1917, was unseasonably heavy. The rain combined with an existing high water table and a churned landscape, destroyed by massive volumes of artillery fire. The result was a roiling morass, which swallowed men, horses, and machines alike. As Lewis gunner Jack Dillon described it, the mud at Passchendaele was very viscous indeed, very tenacious. It stuck to you. It drew at you, not like quicksand, but a real monster that sucked at you. Mark IV Mail specifications. Designed by Major Walter Gordon Wilson. Produced between May 1917 to the end of 1918. Total number built, 1,220. Weight, 28.4 tons. Length, 8.05 meters. Width, 4.12 meters. Crew, 8. Armor, 6.1 to 12 millimeters. Main armament, 2 6-pounder, 57 millimeter. 600 weight QF guns. Secondary armament, 3 Lewis guns. Operational range, 56 kilometers. Speed, 6.4 kilometers per hour. Allied Mark IVs abandoned on the fields of battle were captured by German soldiers where possible. About 40 were employed by the Germans as Beuter Panzerwagen. Beuter means loot or booty, so literally looted tank. Utilizing crews of up to 12, these Beuter Panzerwagens formed 4 tank companies from December 1917 on, after the battles of Third Ypres and Cambrai. Some of these tanks were refitted, including replacing the main armaments with German equivalents.